September 1st, 1939. The same morning, German panzers tore across Polish borders. A 58-year-old man walked into a building that would change everything. His name? George Catlett Marshall. He wore white, deliberately avoiding his uniform. Why? Because he knew what was coming. At 10:30 that morning, Marshall took an oath. Chief of Staff of the United States Army. 4 stars on his shoulders. But here's what they didn't tell you. He had received word of the German invasion at 3:50 a.m. By the time his hand touched that Bible, Warsaw was already burning. The army he inherited? A disaster waiting to happen. Fewer than 190,000 soldiers. Ranked 19th in the world. Smaller than Portugal. Smaller than Switzerland. Smaller than Belgium. Let that sink in. Germany had just unleashed 1.5 million troops on Poland. The entire American army could have been swallowed by a single German army group with room to spare. But the numbers only told half the story. The equipment was ancient. Tanks were so scarce that soldiers trained with trucks bearing cardboard signs that read "tank." The entire arsenal. Less than 500 tanks. Light models that would be shredded to pieces against German panzers in minutes. Artillery? From 1918. Rifles from the trenches of France, 20 years old. The same Springfield models that doughboys had carried into the meat grinder of world. War 1.9 infantry divisions existed on paper. Only 3 approached full strength. The other 6. Skeleton crews. 3,000 men each, instead of the 15,000 needed for combat. 4 armies with staffs of just 400 troops. Not a single American division was combat-ready. Not one. But Marshall saw something others didn't. The real crisis wasn't the equipment. It wasn't the numbers. It was something far more dangerous. Something that could destroy an army from within before the first shot was ever fired. Leadership. The men who would command American soldiers were too old, too comfortable, to set in their ways. Marshall looked at his generals and saw what he later called considerable arterial sclerosis. Their minds had hardened like concrete. The average age was distressingly high. Many had been in the same positions for years, decades even. Same commands. Same social functions. Same bureaucratic battles they'd been fighting since before anyone could remember. Marshall knew something that terrified him. Sentiment and tradition could not be allowed to stand in the way of national survival. Within 2 years, he would force out approximately 600 officers from the army. He would end careers, destroy friendships, make enemies in Congress. He would be accused of gutting the army's brains, and he would create the generation of commanders who won the Second World War. The qualities that made these generals successful. In peacetime, caution, deference to superiors, mastery of bureaucratic procedure, were precisely the qualities that would get men killed in war. Marshall had watched these officers for years. He knew their strengths and weaknesses. He knew which ones could adapt and which could not. The problem had been festering for 20 years. The promotion system in the peacetime army operated almost entirely through seniority. An officer couldn't advance until someone above him retired or died. Merit counted for nothing. Initiative was punished. The safest strategy? Avoid mistakes, cultivate relationships with superiors, and wait. The result was a bottleneck they called the hump. Approximately 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire officer corps, were clustered within an extraordinarily narrow age band. These men had entered during World War I, received rapid wartime promotions, then watch their careers stagnate. For 2 decades, the numbers told a grim story. More than 1,800 captains were in their 40s. Over 1,000 officers qualified for lieutenant colonel remained stuck as captains. 234 lieutenants were also in their 40s, men who had spent more than 2 decades at the most junior commissioned rank. Marshall understood this problem personally. He had been a colonel during the First World War. His performance, exceptional. General Pershing considered him one of the most capable officers in the Army. But after the armistice, Marshall was reduced to captain. The wartime promotions evaporated. He served 15 more years before regaining the rank of colonel. The system that nearly destroyed his own career was now his to reform. Marshall testified before Congress in April 1940 with characteristic bluntness. Leadership in the field depends, to an important extent, on one's legs and stomach and nervous system. It depends on one's ability to withstand hardships and lack of sleep and still be disposed energetically and aggressively to command men on the battlefield. The generals he had inherited could not meet this standard. They were too old to command. Under the terrific pressure of modern war, their minds were set in outmoded patterns and could not change. Marshall had studied the German campaigns in Poland and France. He had seen how speed, aggression, and initiative shattered larger forces that relied on methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new way of war. Their commanders made decisions in hours that would have taken traditional armies days. But removing senior officers wasn't simple. The Army had traditions stretching back to the Revolution. Officers had friends in Congress, connections in industry, classmates scattered throughout the service. Careers spanning decades couldn't be ended without consequence. The political risks, enormous. Every general Marshall pushed aside had former subordinates who would remember. Every forced retirement created enemies who might undermine him later. The wives of senior officers formed a social network in Washington that could make or break reputations. Marshall wasn't merely reforming the Army. He was disrupting a way of life. Marshall proceeded anyway. The mechanism he created became known as the plucking board, though its official name was the removal board. The board consisted of 6 retired general officers, deliberately chosen so serving officers wouldn't be judging their potential rivals. Marshall asked his immediate predecessor, General Malin Craig, to come out of retirement and chair the board. No one could accuse Marshall of settling personal scores when his own predecessor was making the decisions. Marshall's instructions established the governing philosophy. The mission is not to weigh a long and successful career against a failure in 1940 or 1941. It is not the function of the board to determine how good a man has been. Rather, it is to determine the worth and value of the individual to the Army. Today, critical times are upon us. The measure must be today's performance. The board's authority was sweeping. It was empowered to remove any officer for reasons deemed good and sufficient. The documented removals tell part of the story. In summer and fall of 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and Reserve officers. In the 5 years before Marshall took command, only 37 officers total had been removed from the Army, an average of fewer than 8 per year. Marshall increased the removal rate more than 5-fold. Ultimately, 500 colonels were forced into retirement. Marshall himself estimated that he pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States entered the war. The purge was ruthless, systematic, and absolutely necessary. August and September 1941. Louisiana, and East Texas. Nearly 500,000 troops descended on a vast swath of American territory for the largest military exercises in the nation's history. These weren't just tactical drills. They were marshals. Final examination for his officer corps. Units maneuvered day and night. Communications were disrupted. Plans fell apart and had to be improvised. The fog of war descended on commanders who had spent decades in the predictable routine of peacetime. Service? Marshall watched everything. He moved constantly between command posts, observing how generals reacted to setbacks, how they communicated with their staffs, how they maintained morale among exhausted troops. Of the 42 generals who commanded a division, corps, or army during those exercises, only 11 would go on to hold combat commands during the war. The other 31 pushed aside, reassigned, retired. Marshall had seen what he needed to see. One incident became legendary. George Patton, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, was supposed to be contained by a defensive line. Instead, he led his tanks on a night march around the enemy flank, moving so fast that umpires couldn't keep up. At dawn, Patton's tanks burst into Lieutenant General Hugh Drum's headquarters, nominally capturing the commander of the opposing force. The maneuver was brilliant, aggressive, and exactly the kind of initiative Marshall wanted to see. Patton had proven he could move and think faster than his opponents. Drum had proven he could not adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Both lessons would influence Marshall's decisions about who would lead in combat. The men Marshall removed weren't incompetent. Many had served honorably for decades. Some had distinguished records from World War I, but Marshall applied a ruthless standard. Past achievement meant nothing if an officer couldn't perform today. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's best years were behind him. One confrontation illustrated Marshall's approach perfectly. A general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to update the Army's training manuals to reflect lessons from the German campaigns in Europe. He told Marshall the work would take 18 months. Marshall offered 3 months. The general refused. Marshall offered 4 months. The general said it was impossible. Such comprehensive revisions couldn't be completed in less than a year and a half. Marshall asked him to reconsider, warning him to be very careful about that answer. When the general insisted the timeline couldn't be shortened, Marshall's response was immediate. "I am sorry." "Then you are relieved." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. The manuals, incidentally, were completed in 4 months by other officers. Marshall showed the same coldness toward personal friends. One general ordered to France on an important mission explained he couldn't depart quickly because his wife was away and household furniture remained unpacked. Marshall called him personally to confirm this was his position. When the general said it was, Marshall replied, "Well, my God, man, we are at war, and you are a general. I am sorry too, but you will be retired tomorrow." But Marshall's genius wasn't just in removing the wrong officers. It was in identifying the right ones. A legend grew bet that Marshall kept a little black book containing names of promising officers he'd observed throughout his career. The story was repeated so often it became accepted as fact. The black book never existed. What Marshall actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his career, he had observed officers at key vantage points. He had noted who showed initiative and who waited for orders, who could think clearly under pressure and who froze, who could inspire men and who merely commanded them. The list of promising officers existed entirely in his mind. During his years at Fort Benning, approximately 150 future generals attended the infantry school. Marshall watched them all. He assigned them challenging problems and observed how they responded. He noted who asked the right questions and who accepted easy answers. These officers became known as the Marshall Men, and their careers would accelerate dramatically once Marshall gained the power to promote them. The selection of Dwight Eisenhower demonstrated Marshall's methods perfectly. December 14, 1941. Exactly 1 week after Pearl Harbor, Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington.
Understood.
Eisenhower flew from Fort Sam Houston in Texas, arriving exhausted after delays and bad weather. It was the first time he had spoken to Marshall. For more than 2 minutes, Marshall presented a grim overview of the situation in the Pacific. The Philippines were under attack. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia. The strategic situation appeared desperate. Then Marshall posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower asked for a few hours in a desk. Marshall provided both. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum that acknowledged the Philippines couldn't be saved, but argued they couldn't be abandoned either. The United States had to make every effort to support the defenders, even if ultimately futile, because abandoning them would destroy American credibility with allies throughout the Pacific. This analysis became the core Pacific strategy. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly what Marshall wanted to see. Eisenhower hadn't asked for more information. He hadn't requested a committee to study the problem. He hadn't hedged his conclusions with qualifications. He had analyzed the situation, reached a decision, and presented a clear recommendation. Marshall's response revealed his philosophy. Eisenhower, the department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but feel always compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Eisenhower had passed the test. By February 1942, just 2 months later, Eisenhower was chief of the entire War Plans Division. His rise was the fastest of any general in World War II. From lieutenant colonel in December 1941, he became a 5-star general by December 1944. George Patton presented a different challenge. Marshall had known Patton since World War I. The two men were a study in contrasts. Marshall was reserved, methodical, self-effacing. Patton was flamboyant, impulsive, utterly convinced of his own destiny. Marshall regarded Patton as the Allies' best fighting general, but recognized he required management. At 54, Patton fell into the category of officers who might have been pushed aside under Marshall's age standards. He survived only because he demonstrated the energy and drive of a much younger man. Marshall elevated Patton from colonel in July 1938 to 4-star general by April 1945. The journey was tumultuous. Patton's mouth got him into trouble repeatedly. His actions sometimes bordered on insubordination, but Marshall protected him. Twice during the war, Marshall intervened to save Patton's career. Why? Because he recognized that Patton was irreplaceable. The roster of commanders Marshall identified and elevated reads like a history of American victory. Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, Stilwell, Clark, Hodges, Collins, Ridgway, Kruger. These men led American forces from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of Germany, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Philippines and beyond. They defeated two of the most formidable military powers in history simultaneously. The transformation Marshall achieved can be measured in numbers. When he took command in September 1939, The army had fewer than 190,000 soldiers. By 1940, it had grown to 269,000. By 1941, it exceeded 1.4 million. By 1943, nearly 7 million. At its peak in March 1945, the United States Army numbered more than 8 million soldiers, organized into 91 divisions. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force Marshall had inherited 5 years earlier. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, and tested by the system Marshall created. They had survived a plucking board. They had proven themselves in maneuvers and in combat. They were the best officers the American military could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called Marshall the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared that our army and people have never been so indebted to any soldier. Harry Truman said simply that millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. George C. Marshall gave it victory. Marshall's lesson extends beyond military affairs. How do you remove people who have done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions? How do you make room for new talent when existing leaders have earned their places through years of faithful service? Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, personal friendships, political connections, none of these could be allowed to outweigh current capability. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Men would die if leaders could not lead. This principle, demanding excellence, accepting no excuses, measuring leaders by results, transformed an army ranked 19th in the world into the force that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It remains Marshall's enduring legacy.